From the muddy fields of Crécy to the bloody meadows of Agincourt, this simple weapon didn't just pierce armor. It pierced centuries of military tradition. Knights in gleaming armor, the ultimate symbol of feudal power, suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Entire generations of chivalry and nobility, trained to dominate the battlefield, were undone by tens of thousands of arrows raining from above. Most people today remember knights as heroes of legend, but the longbow wasn't just a tool. It was a revolution in how wars were fought. Welcome to Heroic History, where we dig beneath the armor, uncover the hidden forces that change the world, and bring you epic stories of strategy, courage, and invention. Hit subscribe and join our community of history lovers so you never miss a story. So let's ask, how did a simple wooden bow topple the most feared warriors of medieval Europe? Why did the era of the knight come to an end? And how did a few inches of yew and sinew decide the fate of kingdoms? Let's find out. The rolling hills of northern France in the late summer of 1346. It's raining, the ground is slick, the sky is heavy with clouds, and in the distance the sound of hooves echoes across the mud. It's raining, the ground is slick, the sky is heavy with clouds. Across the field, the flower of French chivalry, thousands of armored knights and men-at-arms prepare to charge. They believe, as their ancestors had for centuries, that no army can withstand the shock of a mounted charge. They're about to find out how wrong that belief is. Edward III didn't pick his ground by accident. The English army, roughly 12,000 men, took up a position on a sloping ridge near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu. It was a good piece of land, dry at the top, muddy at the bottom, with open fields that forced the enemy to attack uphill. Edward arranged his men in a carefully designed formation, something between a fortress and a machine. At the center were his men-at-arms, professional soldiers in heavy armor who were dismounted to fight on foot. On both flanks, he placed wedges of longbowmen, the English and Welsh archers, who were his real secret weapon. Their lines jutted out slightly in what chroniclers later called the Crécy formation, a kind of open V shape that could catch enemies in a deadly crossfire. And in front of these lines, the archers drove sharpened wooden stakes into the ground. The stakes weren't fancy, but they served a deadly purpose. Any horse charging uphill would impale itself before reaching the line. Everything about Edward's setup was intentional. The archers would pour out fire to disrupt and funnel the enemy, forcing them to move toward the center, where his dismounted men-at-arms waited in tight formation to finish the job. The English weren't there to chase glory. They were there to survive. The French, meanwhile, came on in vast numbers. Some say as many as 40,000 men under King Philip VI. Their plan wasn't bad on paper. They'd send in the Genoese crossbowmen first to weaken the English line, then follow up with the knights to deliver the killing blow. But almost everything went wrong. It had rained earlier that day, and the moisture had soaked the crossbow strings. Unlike the English longbow bows, whose linen strings could be easily unstrung and kept dry, crossbows had heavy fixed mechanisms that didn't handle water well. When the Genoese loosed their first volleys, their bolts fell short. The English archers, whose bows were still dry and strong, responded with a deafening storm of arrows that tore into the unprotected Genoese ranks. To make matters worse, the Genoese hadn't brought their large shields, pavises, that normally protected them while they reloaded. Some historians, like Kelly DeVries, believe the situation may have been even more complicated. Surviving contracts show that some of these so-called crossbowmen may not even have been properly armed with crossbows or the equipment they were promised. They might have been lightly armed auxiliaries thrown into the front line unprepared. Whatever the truth, when the Genoese tried to retreat, the French knights behind them mistook their withdrawal for cowardice. Furious, Charles II of Alençon, one of the French commanders, ordered his cavalry forward, trampling the Genoese in their path. That act of chaos sealed their fate. The French front line was now a tangled mess of horses, fallen men, and broken discipline, all while English arrows rained down from above. What followed was not one charge, but many. Chroniclers speak of 16 separate assaults, waves of French knights spurring their destriers up the muddy slope toward the English lines. Each time they met the same fate. The longbowmen aimed not at the knights' shining armor, but at their horses. When a horse went down, its rider crashed into the mud, crushed under the weight of his own armor, unable to rise. Imagine that scene, a field churned into muck by hooves and blood, armored men struggling to stand while thousands of arrows hissed through the air. Horses screamed, banners fell, and the thunder of each new charge ended in a chaos of men and metal. The French knights, trained all their lives to charge and crush, suddenly found themselves powerless. The very weapons and armor that symbolized their class had become their downfall. By the time night fell, the fields of Crécy were littered with the bodies of French nobility. Entire generations of noble families were wiped out in a single afternoon. Among the dead were Charles of Alençon, Louis of Blois, the King of Bohemia, and countless others. Men whose deaths would ripple through French politics for decades. The loss of so many nobles shattered the old feudal structure of France. No amount of honor or lineage could protect you from a sky full of arrows. In a single afternoon, honor, lineage, and centuries of battlefield dominance proved no match for disciplined archers and well-chosen terrain. Thousands lay dead, most of them aristocrats, while the English barely lost a few, perhaps only 100 to 300 men. To understand the full magnitude of this shift, we need to grasp what the knight had represented for the previous 3 centuries. For nearly 3 centuries, from around the year 1050 to 1350, the knight stood as the undisputed master of the European battlefield. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a symbol of class, wealth, and honor. A man born into privilege and trained from childhood for the single purpose of fighting on horseback clad in steel and mounted on a war horse that itself could cost a small fortune. The knight embodied a form of warfare where courage and lineage mattered as much as tactics. Their tactical advantage lay in one terrifying maneuver, the massed cavalry charge. Rows of armored horsemen shoulder to shoulder, their long lances tucked beneath their arms, forming a living wall of iron and muscle. When that formation began to move, first at a trot, then a canter, and finally a thunderous gallop, it could shatter almost any enemy formation. Once the enemy's line broke, the knights would ride down fleeing infantry, cutting them apart with swords and maces. For hundreds of years, that formula worked. Battles were decided by the strength and discipline of the mounted elite. Infantry could slow them perhaps, but rarely stop them. Even the rare exceptions like the Scots' victories at Stirling Bridge or Bannockburn were seen as flukes, moments where luck or terrain favored the weaker side. The system seemed eternal, but that very success made it fragile. It encouraged a social and economic order that depended on the idea that only nobles could fight effectively. Why innovate when the old ways still won battles? Why train commoners or invest in ranged weapons when a charge of heavy cavalry could end the fight in minutes? That conservatism became the Achilles heel of chivalric warfare. In France, war wasn't just a matter of strategy or efficiency, it was theater. It was honor, glory, and social standing all rolled into one for the nobility. The battlefield was their stage, and victory was the ticket to immortality. One French scholar even called warfare the truest and most essential form of nobility. That says everything about how they saw themselves. The French military doctrine had become rigid, almost brittle. The belief that armored horsemen could smash through anything had taken on a kind of sacred authority. Even after humiliating defeats in the 14th and 15th centuries, the knight remained the star of the show. Because to abandon the knight was to abandon the identity of the French aristocracy itself. Their pride became their prison. A knight's life revolved around this code. From boyhood he was trained to ride, to hunt, to fight, and to serve. Pages learned how to care for armor and horses before they were tall enough to lift a sword. Squires spent years mastering the lance, the sword, and the etiquette of noble warfare. By the time a man was dubbed a knight, he was the product of an entire social machine that told him he was born to lead, to fight, and to win. The equipment alone reflected that status. A full suit of plate armor could weigh over 60 lelbars and cost as much as a small village. His warhorse, a massive muscled destrier, was bred and trained for years, worth more than many peasants would earn in a lifetime. Everything about him was designed to project power and prestige. Even the glittering banners and heraldry on his shield were symbols of bloodlines and honor, not camouflage but advertisement. Knights didn't fight to kill the enemy. They fought to capture other nobles and ransom them back. For a French lord, killing a rival noble outright was almost wasteful. A captured opponent could bring in a fortune. Records show that many were ransomed quickly, only to return to the battlefield and be captured again later in the same campaign. War for the nobility had become its own strange economy, what some historians call a profitable tournament, where honor, status, and money were all tightly intertwined. But this elegant logic of ransom and honor worked only as long as both sides played by the same rules. On that muddy ridge at Crécy in just one afternoon, all that social order shattered. Honor and lineage offered no protection against a storm of arrows and the chaos of disrupted cavalry charges. It ended the moment a new kind of soldier stepped onto the field, men who didn't care about titles, traditions, or the old codes of chivalry. The longbow shattered that logic. The longbow was a way of life. It's often credited to the Welsh, but it was the English who turned it into a national military institution, drawing a bow that takes 80 to 110 pounds of force. That's like lifting a grown man's weight with one arm over and over again. Some of the heaviest bows found in modern tests reach 160 lb of draw weight, and only the strongest, most practiced men could handle them. To pull that kind of weight, they had to throw their entire body into it, leaning back and driving the power from their legs and shoulders. You couldn't just hand a longbow to a farmer and expect him to fight. It took years, often a lifetime of training. In fact, skeletal studies of medieval archers show their bones literally changed shape over time. Their left arms were thicker, their shoulders warped, and small bone spurs appeared on wrists and fingers. You could identify a longbowman's skeleton centuries later just by looking at those stress marks. Now here's where the longbow really stood out. Speed. Each man carried 60 to 72 arrows, often tucked into a canvas quiver or stuck upright in the mud in front of him for faster access. The rhythm was almost mechanical. Draw, aim, loose, draw, aim, loose. A well-trained archer could shoot 6 to 10 arrows a minute. Compare that to a crossbowman who could manage maybe 1 or 2. Multiply that by 1,000 men, and suddenly you've got a storm of arrows. Thousands of shafts darkening the sky in seconds. Of course, no single arrow could handle every target, and English archers were nothing if not practical. They used different arrowheads for different jobs. If the enemy was wearing chainmail, they used bodkin points, slim square-section tips designed to punch through the tiny rings of mail. Against unarmored foes, they switched to broadheads. Wide razor-edged points meant to tear flesh and cause massive bleeding. At full arc, the longbow could hit targets at around 250 meters. They often fired at a 45-degree angle, so the arrows came down like rain, not just hitting targets but plunging straight into them. That kind of indirect fire wasn't just deadly, it was psychologically crushing. Imagine standing in armor, hearing that hiss growing louder every second, and knowing the next wave was already on its way. Can arrows really pierce armor? This is one of the great debates among historians. Some people like to say that English archers could shoot straight through a knight's armor, but that's not entirely true. Modern tests show that arrows couldn't pierce high-quality steel plate, especially when it was over a millimeter thick or angled to deflect blows. Even a heavy arrow hitting solid steel might just bounce off or leave a dent, but in real battles, most soldiers didn't wear that kind of armor. Full plate was rare and expensive, reserved for nobles. The average French man-at-arms wore a mix of iron, leather, and chainmail, good protection but not invincible. But the English had learned to shoot around it. They aimed for weak points, the gaps at the elbows, the knees, the armpits, even the groin. These were protected only by smaller plates or bits of chainmail, and if that failed, they simply aimed for the horse. War horses were large, expensive, and often less protected. Bring down the horse, and the knight followed, crashing to the ground under hundreds of pounds of steel, where he became easy prey for infantry with knives and mallets. Even when arrows didn't pierce armor, the impact alone could still be crippling. Tests show that a 180 lb draw longbow can hit with enough kinetic energy to bruise or even break bones beneath plate armor. Chroniclers describe French knights at Crécy as being hung with arrows, pinned, dazed, and struggling to move. That's the real secret: disruption. A wave of panic, exhaustion, and broken formation could be just as deadly as a fatal wound. But the English edge was about how they paid for it. French armies relied on knights, professional warriors who were expensive to equip and maintain. An English knight earned about 2 shillings a day, 20 ford. That's roughly 4 times the pay of an English yeoman archer who made 6d a day. 6 pence might not sound like much, but back then it was a solid wage, just a bit higher than what a skilled craftsman made at home. Their battles weren't about honor or noble theatre. They were about earning a living. Archers could also earn extra from looting or capturing low-ranking enemies. They fought not to uphold a social code or secure prestige, but to survive, get paid, and maybe improve their lot in life. Because of that, England could field large professional armies without bankrupting itself. Why? Because paid infantry could be maintained longer and deployed more flexibly than expensive elite cavalry. A knight cost a fortune to equip and feed, whereas a yeoman archer could be trained and retained for a fraction of the price. This wasn't just frugality, it was a strategic multiplier. England could sustain an army long enough to march into France, fight a decisive battle, and survive where larger traditional armies might collapse under cost and logistics. However, the knight didn't just disappear because of one arrow volley at Crécy. Knights didn't vanish overnight. Feudal cavalry had been under pressure socially, economically, and organizationally for years. Taxes were changing, armies were getting larger. Kingdoms needed more reliable troops than seasonal nobles who showed up with a handful of retainers. Crécy was the beginning of the decline, not the final nail. But then Agincourt sealed the point. Henry deployed them in a narrow field, flanked by dense woodland on both sides, creating a bottleneck. This clever positioning forced the French to attack through a confined front, neutralizing their numerical advantage instead of wide flanking maneuvers or cavalry charges from multiple angles. They were funneled straight into the storm. And then there was the weather. Heavy rain had turned the battlefield into a muddy quagmire. French knights clad in 50 to 80 lbs of full plate armor slogged forward knee-deep in muck. Imagine trying to charge at full speed while weighed down by steel, feet sinking into sticky mud, your horse struggling to maintain footing. Many horses collapsed and some knights fell and couldn't get up, trapped in their armor, while a few even drowned in the mud. The combination of longbow barrages and muddy exhaustion transformed the knight's expensive armor from a protective asset into a deadly liability. Arrows didn't have to pierce every plate, just enough to disable horses, jam joints, or disrupt the soldier's balance. And suddenly the elite French force was disintegrating under its own weight. Once the French lines were compressed and immobilized, English archers, trained and versatile, switched from ranged to melee. Armed with swords, axes, or daggers, they joined the final push, exploiting gaps and crushing any remaining resistance. Then came a brutal practical decision. Henry V ordered the execution of a large number of French nobles taken prisoner. Traditionally, capturing a knight promised ransom money and was a cornerstone of chivalric warfare. But here, pragmatism won out. With the French army in chaos, fears of a counterattack, and insufficient English manpower to guard thousands of prisoners, killing them was the safest option. This action sent a clear signal. The old rules of chivalry and ransom no longer guaranteed safety or economic value. The longbow, the yeoman infantry, and disciplined tactics had undermined the social and economic foundations of knightly warfare, showing that professional armies and practical strategy trumped tradition. Together, the two battles, about 70 years apart, marked the bookends of a massive shift. Heavy cavalry went from being the unquestioned rulers of the battlefield to just one part of a much larger military machine. These battles exposed a deeper truth. Firepower, structure, and preparation were stronger than noble birth. This lines up perfectly with the bigger idea historians call the military revolution. Armies weren't just fighting differently, they were built differently. States needed tax systems, supply chains, permanent infantry, and commanders who cared more about planning than pageantry. Warfare became something you prepared for year-round, not something you charged into because honor demanded it. And that's why all of this matters. Because when massed archers beat elite cavalry, society changed with it. Power started shifting away from the old feudal order. A yeoman with a longbow, a farmer, a common man could bring down a noble who had spent his life training for war. Professional soldiers mattered more than family trees. The age of chivalry slowly gave way to an age of organized, state-supported armies. The old system, where status and wealth determined military influence, was being replaced by one where skill, training, and organization mattered more than noble birth. The longbow had democratized lethal force, giving ordinary men a decisive role in warfare. The 100 Years' War, especially the English campaigns, demonstrated that paid professional armies armed with effective ranged weapons could outfight larger feudal forces. France's humiliating defeats forced its monarchy under Charles V and Charles VII to reform its military, creating standing armies of professional soldiers rather than relying solely on noble levies. By the end of the day, knights who had ruled European battlefields for centuries lay broken. Their lances, their armor, even their training, all were powerless against disciplined, massed longbowmen. One afternoon shattered the old order. The longbow wasn't just a weapon, it was a tool that helped reshape how Europe fought, how kingdoms ruled, and who got to hold power. The knight wasn't gone yet, but his era as the supreme force on the battlefield was over. If you want more epic battles and hidden strategies uncovered, subscribe, share this video, and tell me in the comments which medieval weapon or battle you want to explore next.